there, this is Rachel from So Joyful Studio, and this is a tutorial for my Patchwork Playground Quilt pattern. Before we begin, make sure you purchase your fabric and your pattern ahead of time. You can find the links for those in the description below. You'll also want to iron your fabric and gather all of your quilting tools before we begin. Here is a short list of tools that you'll need in order to make this quilt. Start by printing off the cutting instructions sheet, fabric labels, and the swatch sheet. You'll want to do this even if you're planning to use the PDF for the rest of the pattern, and go ahead and cut out those fabric labels once they're printed. To note about fabric is that you'll see at the beginning of the pattern it lists that I assume with the fabric of 42 inches. What that means is from selvage to selvage, so from the raw edge to the raw edge, all around this edge is folded. This is, I'm assuming, 42 inches. Now that's pretty average. Some are greater than that, that's just fine, but if your fabric that you're purchasing lists that it is less than 42 inches from selvage to selvage, you will likely need more yardage. So just be aware this pattern and the cutting instructions are written for a 42 inch minimum with the fabric piece. The pattern lists that we need a 1/4 yard of fabric. So this is a 1/4 yard or 9 inches. And from that, we're going to be cutting out following these cutting instructions depending on the size of quilt you're making. For this tutorial, we're going to be doing the throw size, but the steps you'll follow are the same regardless of which size you make. So on the throw size, we will be starting for fabric A. We're going to cut one 6.5 inch by width of fabric strip. To do this, align the straight edge of your fabric yardage with one of the lines on your cutting mat. From that straight edge, then we will cut a 6.5 inch wide strip of fabric. Go ahead and take this over to your ironing board and press out that crease in the fabric. Next, for fabric A, the instructions say we need to subcut 6.5 inch squares. Sometimes, as is the case with fabric B here, we will just leave these with the fabric strips as is, but in this case for fabric A, we'll go ahead and subcut those 6.5 inch squares. Be sure to add the A1 fabric label to these as soon as they are cut. Once you're finished cutting all of your pieces out, take a piece of scrap fabric and cut a small section of it in order to attach it to the fabric swatch sheet. You can use glue or tape to attach it to the sheet. This will just be used as a reference later on, especially if you're not using the cover quilt colors. Once all my pieces are cut, I like to keep them in these little bins in order to keep everything organized. Up next is strip piecing. Gather 2 B1 pieces and just one of the BG1 pieces. We'll leave the other ones to use later. Using your iron, press out the crease from the fold. Once that's done, go ahead and align your pieces so that your BG1 piece is in the middle and your B1 pieces are on either side. Sew your pieces in this order with right sides together using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. The strip piecing technique just means that we are going to be sewing long strips of fabric together and later cutting them apart. Because of that, we want to make sure that our seams are nice and strong, so reduce your stitch length to be between 1.5 millimeters and 2 millimeters. Once your first B1 piece is sewn to BG1, you can go ahead and sew the other B1 piece to the opposite side of BG1 with right sides together using the 1/4 inch seam allowance just like you did before. Once our seams are sewn, we'll go ahead and press them towards the B1 pieces. First, I like to set them like this, then I open up that B1 piece and press the seam toward the B1 piece. One important aspect of pressing your seams in quilting is that you do not apply pressure as you move your iron. You'll want to reduce pressure, move your iron, and then press down in one spot. Then reduce pressure, move your iron, and press down in one spot. Go ahead and continue on down this strip set, making sure that you continue to press your seams out towards the B1 pieces. Now that we're done, you can see that the strip set is nice and flat. On the back side, you'll see that the seams are pressed out towards those B1 pieces. Before moving on, double check that your strip set is 6.5 inches wide. If your strip set was larger than 6.5 inches, that means that your seam allowance was too small. And if your strip set was smaller than 6.5 inches, then your seam allowance is too large. Let's repeat these steps using D1, F1, H1, and K1 in place of our B1 pieces. Remember that for the throw size, you will have 4 F1 pieces, meaning that in the end, you'll make 2 F strip sets. And just a reminder, if you're making the baby size, you will not be using H1 or K1. Go ahead and sew those strips together just like we did before with B1 and BG1, using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. One of my favorite ways to save time while quilting is to use chain piecing. Here I'll show you what that means. As you are approaching the end of a seam with one strip set, go ahead and grab the next color set, and as you finish off the stitching for one strip, you'll just ease that next set right underneath your presser foot and continue to stitch. Doing this saves you time by not having to cut each seam in between every single piece, instead allowing you just to continue sewing as if it was one long seam. Here I'll show you one more time that we'll just ease this next set right under the presser foot and continue our stitching. Once all of our strip sets are done, we'll go ahead and cut our unit 1s. Start by aligning your strip set with one of the lines on your cutting mat and trim off the raw selvage edge. From this edge, you can go ahead and start cutting your unit 1s at 2.5 inches wide. Make sure you reference the table in the pattern to see how many total unit 1s are needed. For the throw size for B1 strip set, we'll need 6 unit 1s. Once those are cut, you can set them aside. You can continue on to the next color sets. Just be sure to reference that table so you know how many unit 1s are needed for each color set. With all of our unit 1s cut at 2.5 inches wide, we can move on to our unit 2 strip set. It'll be the exact same process that we just followed for unit 1s, except that BG2s will be on the outside and B2, etc. will be on the inside. And for pressing, we're going to be pressing in towards B2 instead of out towards B2 like we did on the last ones. This one's already done, but let's do the color D set together. For unit 2s, we will start with one B2 and align 2 BG2 pieces on either side. Just like we did before, you'll go ahead and sew these strips right side together using the 1/4 inch seam allowance. For the unit 2 strip sets, for pressing, we will be pressing towards the color piece still, but that means that our seams will be pressed in towards D2 instead of out towards D1 like we did when pressing the unit 1 strip sets. Once all of your strip sets are completed, you can go ahead and start cutting out your unit 2s. First, trim off that selvage edge like we did before, and then cut your unit 2s at a 2.5 inch wide strip. Be sure to reference the table in the pattern for the total unit 2s that are needed for the size of quilt that you're making. Continue to cut each strip set until you've finished cutting out all your unit 2s. When your unit 1s and 2s are done, pair them up by color. For the baby and throw size, to make a 9 patch, align 2 unit 1s on either side of one unit 2. Place them right sides together and nest those seams. What that means, as you can see here, is that the seams, because they are pressed in opposite directions, will nestle into each other as we sew. That's really going to hold that seam tight, so when we're done, we get a nice point there. Go ahead and sew that 1/4 inch seam allowance, being sure to keep those seams nested as you sew, and when you open it up, you can see that those corners are locked in place. Next, sew the next Unit 1 piece to Unit 2, right sides together on the opposite side. Once your seam is sewn, we'll go ahead and press those seams. This time we'll be pressing out towards Unit 1. Our 9 patch is now nice and flat, and on the back you can see that our seams are pressed out towards the Unit 1 pieces. The only difference is for the mini size, color sets B, F, and K will follow the same steps that we just discussed. However, for color sets D and H, we will reverse Unit 2 and Unit 1 in the order. Because this tutorial is for a throw size quilt, I'll stick with the Unit 1s on the outside with one Unit 2 on the inside and go ahead and sew the rest of my 9 patches. At this point we're ready for quilt assembly. If you do not have a large enough surface area to lay out your quilt, such as a floor space or a large table, you can hang a piece of flannel fabric on the wall using duct tape like I've done here, and your fabric pieces will stick to it naturally. Whether on the wall or on the floor, lay out your pieces so that you can visualize what the quilt will look like. For row assembly, we'll be sewing these 6.5-inch squares and 9 patches together in the order that they are laid out. These will be sewn right side together with our 1/4-inch seam allowance, and the seams will be pressed either all to the left or all to the right, depending on the direction of the arrow in the pattern on the right side of the diagram. Continue down each row, sewing them in order as laid out. Once each row is finished, you can go ahead and sew your rows together from top to bottom. Since we have been pressing the row seams in opposite directions, you'll be able to nest your seams just like we did when sewing our 9 patches together, giving us nice crisp points like you see here. The seams we sew in this step will be pressed down towards the bottom of the quilt. Go ahead and continue on sewing your rows together all the way down the quilt until you have a finished quilt top. Next, we need to piece our backing. In order to do this, fold your backing yardage in half lengthwise and cut your yardage along that fold so that you have 2 equal length pieces. Align your 2 backing pieces right sides together along the selvage and sew using at least a 1/2-inch seam allowance. Here you can see I've done a little bit more than 1/2-inch seam allowance in order to make sure that I didn't catch that selvage printing in the seam. If you did the same and your seam allowance includes the selvage, go ahead and trim that seam allowance down to 1/2 inch. Once your seam allowance is trimmed, you can go ahead and press that seam open. When purchasing batting, typically you can buy 1 large piece of batting for the size quilt that you are making or slightly larger, and no piecing will be needed of your batting. However, if you are using scraps of batting or yardage and you need to sew 2 pieces of batting together, you can do so using a zigzag stitch like I've done here. By butting those 2 pieces of batting up next to each other and catching each one in either side of the zigzag stitch. Next, we'll create our quilt sandwich, starting with our backing fabric, laying right side down. I'll be completing this process on a table, and therefore I'll be taping my backing fabric at the top just to make sure it doesn't slide off. But you can also just do this on the floor and lay the whole piece out at once if you have an area of floor large enough and that is hard surfaced. Once your backing fabric is down, just smooth out any wrinkles that you see before placing your batting on top. Align your batting so that you have about 1 to 2 inches from the edge of the backing fabric, and then smooth out your batting as best you can to avoid any wrinkles. Once your batting is all smoothed out, place your quilt top right side up on top of the batting, leaving about a ½ inch to 1 inch around the edge of the batting, and then smooth out any wrinkles, being sure not to apply too much pressure to distort the quilt top. My preferred method of basting is to use a basting spray. This is my favorite kind. Feel free to use another method of basting like pin basting or glue basting if you prefer. Carefully peel back the batting and quilt top and spray a nice coat of your basting spray all over the backing. Once you've covered your backing with basting spray, go ahead and slowly and carefully roll back out your batting and quilt top over top so that it sticks to that new basting spray you just sprayed. Lightly use your hands to push out any wrinkles and adhere that batting to the backing fabric. Now repeat this process, but only pulling back the quilt top and leaving the batting in place. Be sure to pick off any strings or threads or lint that you see here because it will be seen through light colored fabrics on your quilt top. Once you coat your batting with basting spray, go ahead and carefully place that quilt top back out by rolling it evenly and then smoothing out any wrinkles with your hands. If you're working on a table, once both those layers are secured with the basting spray, you can shift your quilt over and continue this process for the rest of your quilt by pulling back each layer individually and alternate between spraying your basting spray and then rolling each layer back out. Repeat this process until your quilt is entirely basted. I've sped up the rest of this process since it just repeats itself, but left it in so that you do have a visual of how I finished basting this quilt. Once our basting is finished, I'll go ahead and trim off the extra wide piece of backing fabric at the bottom, just so that I don't have to drag it around with me. And then I'm going to take my quilt over to my ironing board and just iron out each of these layers. We do this in order to set the basting spray, so it really holds tight while we quilt. For quilting pattern, feel free to quilt in whatever pattern your heart desires. Whatever you can think up is great. Here I'm going to be showing you a straight line quilting grid that's simple and straightforward but still looks really nice when it's done. Using a hair marker and a ruler, I'm just measuring 1 inch off of each of the long seams between the rows and the columns. Once our whole quilt is marked, we're ready to quilt. When quilting on my domestic machine, I use a walking foot and I increase my stitch length to 4.0 millimeters just because I like that visually. You can do a couple tests and see what you like best. Otherwise, I simply start at the top and work towards the bottom. The one important thing to know when doing straight line stitching like this for quilting is to always have your seams sewn in the same direction. So if you start at the top of the quilt and sew towards the bottom of the quilt, you want to continue that pattern until you reach the center of the quilt, in which case then we'll have to spin the quilt around, which I'll show you shortly, in order to fit it inside of our machine. You can see that I use quilting gloves in order to help me give a little grip on the fabric. You can use gardening gloves or any sort of gloves that have a little grip. It helps hold the quilt, especially for larger size quilts that are a little bit heavy. I typically start on one edge and work towards the center of my quilt. As I do that, I will roll up the edge in order to fit it in the throat space of my sewing machine. You may need to do this as well. As you quilt, you don't want to pull or push the quilt through the machine. Let the machine pull the quilt through on its own and do the work. Now that I've reached the center of my quilt, I need to spin my quilt around because otherwise my quilt won't fit through my machine. Once I get it all rolled up and ready to go, I'll just continue stitching all the way down to the other side. Once I've finished all the stitching in this direction from top to bottom or bottom to top, then I will spin it 90 degrees and work in the other direction. When all of your quilting is done, you can go ahead and trim up your quilt, cutting off the excess batting and backing fabric and making sure that your corners are square. To make our binding, we'll cut the number of 2.5 inch by width of fabric strips that the pattern references. For the throw size here, we need to cut 7 2.5 inch by width of fabric strips. Go ahead and press out this crease in each of the width of fabric strips. We will be sewing our strips together using diagonal seams, starting with one width of fabric strip right side up and angling another right side down perpendicular to each other and sewing a seam from top to bottom along this diagonal line. Feel free to use pins or clips if you think that would be helpful while stitching. Continue to sew all the strips together end to end using this method, being sure that you're sewing them right sides together. Once all of your strips are sewn together, let's trim all those seam allowances down to 1/4 inch. Press all of the seams open, first with your finger and then with your iron. Once all of your seams are pressed open, fold that binding strip in half widthwise, wrong sides together so we're hiding all of the seams we just sewed, and press. Continue this along the entire length of the binding. Using a scissors or rotary cutter, go ahead and trim off all of these little corners. These are called dog ears. We'll trim those off in order to reduce bulk. To attach the binding to the back side of your quilt, align the raw edge of the binding with the raw edge of the quilt. We'll start stitching about a foot down on the binding and sew your binding on using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. As you approach a corner, slow your stitching down and stop 1/4 inch from the edge. Put your needle down 1/4 inch from the edge and rotate your quilt 45 degrees and continue your stitch at a diagonal through the corner of your quilt. Cut your thread and then pull your binding back against that diagonal seam that you just stitched, folding it then over itself, aligning the raw edge of the binding with the raw edge of the quilt again. Start your 1/4 inch seam allowance stitch again, starting at the edge of the quilt where you left off. Continue to sew that 1/4 inch seam now all the way down that side of the quilt, and then repeat the process at the next corner. As you turn the last corner and approach your starting point, leave a space between binding ends of about 8 to 10 inches. be sure to backstitch here at the end. You should now have two ends of binding that are separated by 8 inches of space. I like to trim that first piece of binding down to about 6 inches long. Then overlap the other binding end by 2.5 inches and trim. Once both ends are trimmed down to 2.5 inches, we'll sew that diagonal seam just like we did when we first made our binding strip, putting right sides together and aligning the corners. In this case, I like to use wonder clips or pins because things can get a little bit tricky, but just go slowly and you'll be able to align them well. Mark the diagonal line for stitching from corner to corner. Once you've sewn this seam and before you've trimmed back the seam allowance, double check that you've sewn it correctly and that the binding lays flat. If all looks okay, go ahead and trim that seam allowance down to 1/4 inch and just use your fingers to press that seam open before folding it over onto itself. Give it a quick press with your iron and then go ahead and stitch that opening closed in the binding along the edge. Once your binding is completely attached to the back side of your quilt, go ahead and take your iron and press that binding away from the backing fabric. Flip your quilt over and fold the binding around to the top of the quilt using wonder clips to hold it in place. To create a nice mitered corner, fold one edge of the binding down and use your iron to slightly press a little crease into the edge there. And then fold the next edge over, making sure that the corner of the binding meets the corner of the quilt top there. Add a clip to hold it in place and continue down the edge of the quilt. Sew your binding down using a top stitch along the edge of the binding as close as you can get. I recommend using a thread on the bobbin that matches your backing fabric as closely as you can. Otherwise, your stitching will show up on your backing fabric, as I'll show you here in a minute. At the corners, continue your stitching until you catch the next edge of binding fabric in your needle. Leave your needle down, raise your presser foot, and rotate your quilt. Put your presser foot back down and then continue your stitching. Here you can see how we get a nice mitered corner using this technique. Congratulations, you've finished your Patchwork Playground quilt!